The mahogany conference table gleamed like a museum exhibit under recessed lights. The Cade family never did anything halfway, not even grief. Polished stone floors, fresh-cut white lilies, and bottled water with glass tumblers. Everything about the law office screamed curated legacy. It was the kind of place where endings came with embossed folders and strategic handshakes. No crying, no real emotion, just ceremony. I walked in alone, wearing a black coat that still held the smell of yesterday's rain and the faint chalkiness of drywall dust from my studio. My heels clicked once on the marble, then silence. I hadn't seen my parents in almost 8 months, not since I declined the invitation to their family-only Christmas gala, which they later claimed had been just a casual gathering. That was always their trick. Make me feel like the one who left. But I didn't come here to play memory games. I came because Evelyn Cade asked me to, and when your grandmother says, "Show up when they open the will, don't speak, just listen," you do exactly that. Mark and Deborah Cade were already seated at the head of the table side by side like two matching bookends. My father wore a navy three-piece suit and a face like polished stone, impressive if you didn't know how hollow it really was. My mother's blouse was ivory silk, perfectly steamed her hair in a soft twist. She gave me the tight-lipped nod she reserved for former assistants and neighbor dogs she didn't like. Ara sat across from them, legs crossed, tablet in her lap, like she had an investor meeting in an hour. Her gaze slid over me and kept going, not even a flicker. I sat at the far end without a word, placing my hands together in my lap. Palms down, no rings, no show. I'd been through deployments in desert wind and architectural battles over zoning disputes. This was just posturing. Stage lighting and polished cruelty. The door clicked shut and Ms. Stowe entered, a trim, silver-haired attorney in a charcoal pantsuit holding a leather folio like it was sacred text. She gave me the faintest smile. The kind that said, "I remember you were the one who brought Evelyn soup in January." Then she cleared her throat and began. "I want to thank you all for being here today for the formal reading of Evelyn Cade's will," she said. "This is the version filed on record dated 8 months prior to her passing and witnessed by myself and an external notary." Her voice was calm, clipped, respectful. She started with the expected items, small gifts that meant more than they appeared. To Ara, the emerald pendant Evelyn wore to every board meeting. To Deborah, her first edition poetry books, the ones she never let anyone borrow. To Mark, the grandfather clock from her study. I could practically feel him recoil. Mark hated that clock. Evelyn knew. Then came the pause. A tiny shift in weight as Ms. Stowe turned the page. To my granddaughter Emerson Cade, she said with deliberate clarity, "I leave the Cade family residence at 64 Hillside Lane. Full ownership including mineral rights outbuildings and all architectural records therein." You could hear a pin drop. Or maybe that was the sound of Mark's ego cracking. Mark turned sharply toward Ms. Stowe. "Excuse me." His tone was controlled, but only barely. "It's stated clearly in the will," she replied, handing him a copy. My mother gave a short breath that sounded like a laugh. She must have been confused. "Emerson isn't." She stopped herself. Even she knew better than to say it out loud. Ms. Stowe, unfazed, reached into her folder and slid a document toward me. I didn't touch it. I already knew what it was. Then Mark moved, quick, sharp. He stood, reached across the table, and snatched the deed from the folder like it personally insulted him. His hand trembled slightly, not from age or illness, but from the fury of not being in control. "This is absurd," he said. She was slipping. "Everyone knows it." My mother reached into her handbag and pulled out her gold-plated letter opener, the one she always carried to keep things elegant. She handed it to him without looking. Mark took it, ran the blade through the center of the page, then tore the halves again until there were 4, then 8, jagged scraps of legal ownership falling like feathers onto the polished table. "She didn't mean this," he said louder now. "We're her real children." Ara didn't move. She didn't need to. Her silence was its own kind of complicity. Ms. Stowe opened her mouth to object, but I raised one hand just slightly. "It's fine," I said, voice low but steady. "Let them." And the room went still. The scraps of paper sat there like ashes. My father sat back down, chest heaving just slightly. My mother adjusted her necklace. Ara was staring at the folder like it might rearrange itself if she looked hard enough. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even blink. I just smiled. Not the kind you wear to be polite. Not the kind that forgives. The kind you wear when you've already seen the final frame of the film and everyone else is still arguing over the first scene. Because what they just tore to pieces, that wasn't the real deed. The kitchen always smelled like cinnamon and something slightly burnt, usually Evelyn's first attempt at a new recipe. She was never afraid to fail, not even at 92. Half the point of baking is messing up the first one, she'd say, waving away the smoke from a too-crisped scone. That way you learn what flour and pride have in common, both are better measured loosely. I think she knew I needed those lessons more than I let on. I was 12 when the Cades adopted me. A foster placement turned permanent a formality after 2 years of trial holidays and supervised birthday parties. Deborah Cade wanted a daughter who could play the cello and smile in photographs. Mark wanted another name on the tax return that looked good in a Christmas card. I was neither. I wasn't angry, not at first. Just confused by how kindness could be so rehearsed. Everything felt like a presentation. My room redecorated without asking, my wardrobe replaced with monogrammed polos, choreographed compliments at brunch with donors. I learned quickly that being grateful wasn't enough, I had to be impressive. But Evelyn was different. She didn't ask for performance, she offered presence. The first time I met her, she handed me a pair of garden shears and said, "Cut where the rose has stopped trying." I didn't understand until the next spring when that same bush bloomed twice as bright. That's how she was with people too. We spent whole weekends in her backyard, hands dirty with soil and butter, our aprons crusted with flour by noon. She taught me how to make pie crust from scratch, how to prune a stubborn elm, and how to spot when someone was smiling just to win. Evelyn didn't have time for shallow people, and she didn't hide that fact, especially not with her own children. They learned how to inherit, she'd whisper to me over shortbread dough, but never how to earn. Over the years, I began to see the patterns. Ara always polished and practiced rehearsing speeches in the mirror for the Cade Foundation. Mark treating Evelyn's stories like relics of a woman already fading. Deborah tightening her voice every time Evelyn disagreed with her as if dissent was a personal betrayal. And me, well, I became the family's variable. Sometimes trotted out for photos, sometimes forgotten in logistics. But Evelyn saw me in a way they didn't. Not as a charity case or a wild card. Just as Emerson. 2 weeks before she passed, I visited her like I always did Sunday morning after my design meetings with a loaf of banana bread and a thermos of spiced tea. She was sitting on the sun porch, wrapped in that yellow knit shawl she refused to part with. She looked smaller, like life had started folding her inward. "I want to give you something," she said. Her voice was thin but sharp, like the last chord of a piano piece you don't want to end. From under her lap blanket, she pulled out a small envelope. It was sealed with red wax, the kind you'd expect from a fairy tale scroll. "If they try to erase you," she said, placing it gently in my hand, "open it." I remember laughing, trying to play it off. Erase me. Her eyes didn't flinch. "They've done it before. They'll try again. But I know what I left you." I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket and nodded, not fully understanding what she meant. She didn't explain further. Evelyn never repeated herself when she knew you were listening. And I was listening. When the call came 2 weeks later, Deborah's clipped voice saying Evelyn had passed quietly in her sleep, I sat on my kitchen floor for an hour, envelope untouched, hands numb. The woman who taught me to make pie without a recipe, who told me weeds were just misunderstood plants, who once rewired an entire porch light because the contractor looked like he'd never held a screwdriver, was gone. I wore her shawl that day. Didn't even realize until I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, her scent still tucked into the yarn. I placed the envelope in the back of my bookshelf behind the first drafting sketch I ever submitted for a public park installation, the one Evelyn hung in her hallway like it was a Monet. I didn't expect to ever need that envelope. Honestly, I thought she was being cautious, overprotective, maybe even sentimental in a way she normally wasn't. I thought my parents were petty, yes, but not cruel. Not the kind of people who would tear up a legal document in front of a lawyer and call it justice. But sitting in that cold office watching them rip the deed with surgical contempt, I felt nothing but stillness. Because now I understood. Evelyn hadn't been warning me out of fear. She had been preparing me for war. The county recorder's office was quiet, in the way government buildings always are, fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, and a faint smell of paper warmed by computer fans. It wasn't Evelyn's kind of place. She liked hardwood and citrus oil. But it was where the truth lived, not in feelings, not in family dinners or monogrammed heirlooms, but in filings, timestamps, and public record. I stood at the counter still wearing the blazer I'd worn to the will reading, even though the sleeves were too stiff and the collar rubbed. The woman behind the glass was polite, middle-aged with soft curls and a name tag that read Denise. She asked me for the parcel number and I handed over a sticky note I'd written it on the night before. My handwriting was messier than usual. I hadn't slept much. I'm just confirming the most recent deed transfer, I said, keeping my voice even. The property at 64 Hillside Lane. She nodded and typed for a moment, the rhythmic clicking filling the space. Then she tilted her head. Not what you want to hear from a records clerk. Is something wrong? I asked, trying not to lean forward too fast. She glanced up. It shows a recorded change of ownership 4 months ago. The name listed now is Emerson Hall. That's you. The last name landed like a dropped brick. Hall. My birth name. A name I hadn't used since I was 12 years old, since the court stamped it away and handed me a new one. I felt my throat tighten. That used to be my legal name, I said slowly. But I've gone by Cade since the adoption. Well, the deed shows Emerson Hall, she repeated, eyes flicking from the screen to me. Do you have ID with that name I don't? I said, heart starting to drum. I haven't used Hall in over 15 years. She hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Hold on, let me check the name change filings associated with this deed. I watched the screen reflect in her glasses. Her mouth tightened slightly. Okay, she said, her voice more cautious now. There's a change of name form attached legally reverting Emerson Cade to Emerson Hall. It's dated March 17th of this year. I stared at her. That's impossible. I didn't file anything like that. Well, it was signed under medical authority, she said. Power of attorney documentation is attached. It says Evelyn Cade granted her authority to Mark Cade in February due to declining health. No, I said. She didn't. Evelyn didn't give anyone power of attorney, especially not him. Denise gave a small practiced shrug, the kind of gesture that said, we don't make the rules, we just input them. She turned her monitor slightly so I could see the digital document. I leaned in. It was an image of a scanned power of attorney form typed cleanly signed by Evelyn in script I didn't recognize. Not shaky, not aged, almost printed. Then I saw the date. April 3rd. Evelyn died March 27th. I felt the chill run up my arms like frost forming under skin. That's after she died, I whispered. Denise blinked. Excuse me. Evelyn passed away the week before that form was supposedly signed. She looked at the screen, then back at me. Do you want a printed copy of the filing record? Yes, I said quickly. Everything. The deed, the name change formed the power of attorney. Everything tied to that parcel number. She nodded and walked to the back, leaving me standing in that fluorescent light pulse throbbing behind my ribs. I stared at the monitor. The fake signature. The impossible date. The quiet audacity. They didn't just rip up the real deed at the reading. They had already erased me from the record before it even happened. Denise returned a few minutes later with a manila folder and a receipt for $1,250. I took it with steady hands. She gave me a careful look. You might want to speak to an attorney, she said softly. This kind of thing. It doesn't usually happen by accident. I nodded once. It wasn't. Outside, I sat in my car for a long time, engine off folder unopened in my lap. The air smelled like wet asphalt and dried pine from the parking lot trees. I thought about the way Mark's hands didn't tremble when he tore that fake deed. How Deborah didn't even ask a single question. How Ara kept her gaze off me entirely, like she already knew how this would play out. They hadn't come to that will reading to contest Evelyn's choice. They'd come because they believed they'd already erased it. My fingers drifted to my purse where the red wax-sealed envelope still sat in the inner pocket untouched since that day on Evelyn's porch. I hadn't opened it. Not yet, but I could feel it now like pressure against my ribs. They tried to erase me, and Evelyn had known they would. I didn't open the envelope in the car. I didn't trust myself to be still enough. My fingers were twitching, heart pulsing against my wristwatch. I needed quiet. Wood. Something real. Back at the studio, I laid the envelope on my drafting table like it was evidence in a trial I hadn't realized I was part of. The wax seal was still intact, deep crimson with Evelyn's initials pressed perfectly in the center. Old-fashioned, yes, but Evelyn never did anything without intention, especially when it came to permanence. I slid it open with my utility knife, carefully slicing through the wax and fold. Inside were 3 items. The first, a small brass key attached to a hand-stitched tag that read 1929. It was smooth, worn down at the edges, and ice cold even in my warm fingers. Evelyn had terrible arthritis. There's no way she wrote that tag recently. But the lettering, it was hers. I knew that looping 9 from every birthday card she ever wrote. The second, a folded sheet of parchment paper. Unfolding it revealed a floor plan, our house 64 Hillside Lane, sketched in Evelyn's unmistakable thin black lines. Red markings circled the northeast corner of the basement near the old coal chute that had been bricked up for decades. There were arrows. Annotations in pencil support beam moved in 74 false panel here. It wasn't a drawing. It was a map. And then came the third item, a packet of legal pages crisp and clipped together with a blue binder. At the top, Declaration of Irrevocable Trust. My eyes scanned the header, then the second line. Grantor Evelyn Cade. Trustee Emerson Cade. Beneficiary Emerson Design Trust. My mouth went dry. The document named me as sole trustee of an entity Evelyn had established 8 months ago, just weeks after her last hospital stay. The trust's only asset, 64 Hillside Lane, fully transferred and protected under a separate entity. I flipped to the signature page. Evelyn's name signed in steady ink. 2 witnesses. A notary stamp dated and filed. It had been recorded, legal, binding, untouchable. She knew. Evelyn knew they'd come for it. She knew what Mark and Deborah would do. So she didn't just leave me the house in her will, she gave it to me in full silently through a trust. No challengeable probate, no signature games, just quiet ownership wrapped in legal concrete. My chest tightened not with fear but something closer to awe. She hadn't just protected the property, she'd protected me. I leaned back in my stool, key still in one hand, trust document in the other. The red markings on the floor plan caught my eye again. I walked over to my bookshelf and pulled out the rolled-up architect's copy of the house she once gifted me for my birthday. Same shape, same corner. The northeast basement wall. There had always been something off about that section, the plaster cracked faster there, the floor slightly uneven. I'd asked Evelyn once years ago if it had ever been renovated. She just smiled and said, some things were built to stay hidden until you need them. Now, apparently, I needed them. I grabbed my flashlight gloves and the old lockbox I kept studio receipts in just in case whatever I found needed safekeeping. The house was only 20 minutes away. I hadn't been back inside since the memorial when Mark had greeted guests in the foyer like he'd never threatened to rehome the mutt after I brought home a stray during college. The key sat on the passenger seat beside me as I drove heavier than it looked. I kept glancing at it like it might disappear. By the time I reached the driveway, dusk was crawling up the siding. The garden Evelyn used to tend had overgrown in patches, the ivy curling back toward the porch railing. I unlocked the front door with my own spare key when Mark clearly didn't know I still had and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar and lavender sachets the way it always had. I went straight to the basement. The light switch clicked on, revealing cool concrete and old paint cans stacked in the corner. I found the wall on the plan. Same spot. Same measurements. I tapped along the baseboards with the flashlight handle. Nothing. Then I tried higher along the edge where the old beam crossed. A hollow thunk. My pulse jumped. I ran my gloved hand across the plaster. Faint seam, barely visible. I pressed and a section gave way slightly. A panel. I pulled gently, revealing a small recess carved between studs. Inside, a fireproof box. The lock read 1929. I slid in the key. It clicked. Smooth. Meant to be opened. I didn't lift the lid. Not yet. I just stood there in the dim basement box in hand and whispered into the quiet, "I see you, Evelyn. I see you." I came back the next day with a calm face and a fabricated excuse, something Evelyn herself would have approved of. Just grabbing a photo album, I'd told Deborah over the phone. I kept my voice soft, deliberate, not suspicious. She didn't argue, though I heard the hesitation in her breath. "Don't make a mess," she'd said, as if I were 15 again and tracking mud onto her imported rugs. I parked at the bottom of the hill and walked up the drive like a guest. Mark's SUV was gone, which was ideal. Deborah's car sat under the carport hood, still ticking from a recent trip. Probably a lunch with her garden club, the same women who once whispered that I wasn't really a Cade. I rang the bell, even though I still had a key in my coat pocket. Deborah opened the door halfway still, and Pearl's eyes narrowed like she'd expected me to show up with a lawyer. "Upstairs, second closet," I said before she could say anything more. "That old green album. Evelyn used to keep it wrapped in a dish towel." She moved aside with a sigh and gestured toward the staircase. "Don't go through the drawers. We've already boxed up her personal things." I smiled politely. Of course. But I didn't go upstairs. I waited until Deborah returned to the kitchen, her footsteps fading into the clink of teacups and whatever passive-aggressive texting she was likely doing. Then I slipped quietly through the hall to the music room. It hadn't changed. Not in decades. The baby grand still stood near the arched window, its glossy surface draped with a crocheted runner and a vase of dried hydrangeas. The shelves still held Evelyn's songbooks, handwritten scores, and jazz standards she insisted I learn, even when I begged to switch to digital keys. I could almost hear her humming half a beat off tempo, never apologizing for it. I moved to the bench. It was the old one, tufted green velvet on a mahogany frame. I remembered tracing the legs with my fingers as a kid while Evelyn played. The bench had always squeaked slightly when she sat down, just enough to warn you something was about to begin. I lifted the lid. Sheet music, lots of it. Debussy Ellington, a few of my old scribbled compositions from college that Evelyn had refused to throw out. I set them aside gently. Then I checked the floor plan again. Her sketch had been precise, a narrow rectangle drawn just under the main chamber of the bench, marked with a star and one small word, hollow. I felt along the inner panel. The velvet lining didn't reach the corners. I slid my hand beneath the frame, pressing gently, and then I heard it. A soft click. The false back gave way. Behind it, a narrow compartment barely wider than a shoebox. Inside, a thick manila envelope. I pulled it out with trembling fingers and opened it on my lap. The first item, the original deed to 64 Hillside Lane. Signed, dated, watermarked. Ink slightly faded with time, but unmistakably real. It was notarized in person 8 years ago, when Evelyn had first begun talking about the future of the house with me, long before the cancer, long before the family started circling like buzzards. She hadn't just trusted the law. She'd trusted redundancy. I held it for a moment, this paper that was legally mine and yet almost destroyed by people who claimed to love her. Then I found the second item, a letter written in Evelyn's familiar hand on thick cream stationery, the kind she kept stacked neatly in her secretary desk. No greeting, no date, just truth. They'll destroy the copy. That's why you need the one they can't touch. If you're reading this, they've done what I always feared they would. But don't let their panic fool you. Panic is the last thing a liar shows before their grip slips. This house is yours. Always was. It's where I raised your spirit, not just your body. Love is not inherited, it's built. Let them fight over the ashes. You hold the blueprint. I read it twice, then a third time. It didn't sting. It didn't even surprise me, because deep down I'd always known Evelyn's love wasn't performative. It wasn't performative when she taught me how to change a flat tire or when she mailed me hand warmers during finals week. It wasn't performative when she showed up to my first public installation, even after Mark made some snide joke about sandbox sculptures. Evelyn had never just given me shelter. She had given me structure. I refolded the letter and slipped it along with the deed into the inner sleeve of my coat. By the time I stepped into the hallway again, Deborah was waiting. She gave me a long look, trying to read my face. "Did you find the album?" she asked. "I did?" I said, holding up a dusty binder I grabbed from the hall table. "Exactly where you said." She nodded. "Well, good," I smiled. "Thanks for letting me stop by." Then I turned and walked out the door, Evelyn's words echoing behind every step. "Let them fight over the ashes. You hold the blueprint." The call came late in the afternoon, just as I was finishing up a materials quote for a client in Ridgewood. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. Same number. I answered, more annoyed than curious. "We need to talk." Mark's voice barked, skipping any kind of greeting. "Tonight." No mention of what. No question if I was free. Just the assumption that I'd obey like I always had to once upon a time. When I arrived at the house, Deborah was already standing at the end of the long hallway like she'd been waiting for a verdict. Her arms were crossed pearls tight against her throat, and the set of her mouth told me this wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a declaration. Mark sat in Evelyn's old leather chair, legs wide, hands resting heavily on the armrests like a man used to being listened to. Ara was perched on the corner of the couch, her legs curled under her expression unreadable. She didn't look at me. Not once. I didn't sit. "You went back to the house," Mark began, his voice low, the kind of low that pretends to be calm but simmers with threat. "And you took things. Things Evelyn left to me," I said. "That weren't yours to begin with." Deborah snorted. "Don't start with that. You think a woman dying of stage 4, anything knew what she was signing. She could barely hold a pen." "She knew exactly what she was doing," I replied, pulling the trust document from my coat and setting it on the coffee table like evidence at trial. "And she did it long before you think. This was notarized 8 months before she passed. Filed. Legal." Deborah didn't reach for it. She stared at me like I'd spit in her drink. Mark didn't blink. "You manipulated her," he said slowly. "You isolated her, fed her lies about us. That's Elder Fraud Emerson. That name again, Emerson." As if using my first name somehow made them sound righteous, as if they hadn't spent years trying to whittle me down into something more palatable. "You want to talk about manipulation," I shot back. "Let's talk about the power of attorney you filed after she was already gone. Or the legal name change you pushed through without my knowledge." Ara shifted slightly. Her hand twitched against the edge of the cushion. Still no eye contact. I turned to her. "Was it you? Did you file it?" She didn't answer, but the guilt flared in her throat like heat rising from a sealed kettle. "Why?" I asked quietly. "Why go that far?" She was scared, Deborah said before Ara could even exhale. We all were. You were taking things, claiming things that weren't yours. "They were mine," I said, and Evelyn made sure of it. Mark stood hands fisting. She was confused. She had moments of clarity, yes, but she didn't mean for you to have everything. The house, the land, the investments, she would have divided it. "No," I said. "She would have tried. And you would have found a way to stop her like you always did." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to something poisonous. "You think you're clever? But the house is already under contract. We have a buyer. You can take your fake paperwork and go cry to a judge, but it won't matter." I raised my brow. "You're selling property you don't legally own. That's called fraud, Mark. And the trust is real. Ask your lawyer." "I am a lawyer," he snapped. "Not in probate. And definitely not when you're listed as a potential beneficiary, which makes you biased. Conflict of interest. That's page 1 stuff." Ara finally looked up. There it was. That tiny flicker of recognition. That small, painful shame in her expression, like maybe she'd known deep down it was wrong all along. But she still said nothing. Deborah reached for the trust documents, flipped through them like she was hoping the ink would rub off in her hands and disappear. "This won't stand," she whispered. "It already is," I said, voice flat. "I'm not the one faking signatures. I'm not the one tearing up paper in front of witnesses. And I'm definitely not the one who needs to be afraid of what comes next." I turned toward the door hand, already on my keys. "You can try to sell the house," I added as I opened it. "But you'll be explaining that to a judge, and to the escrow office, and to the press if it comes to that." Mark muttered something under his breath. Deborah didn't respond. Ara stared down at her hands, motionless. I stepped outside, the air sharper than before, cleaner somehow, and I didn't look back. It started with a card decline. I was standing in line at the hardware co-op downtown buying reclaimed wood and copper piping for a client's foyer renovation when the clerk handed my card back with a puzzled look. "Says it's locked." "Want to try another?" I didn't panic. "Not yet." I chalked it up to a system error. Maybe the fraud filter flagged something. I used my backup card, smiled, carried my supplies out, and didn't think too much of it until I opened my banking app in the truck and saw the words, "Account access restricted. Contact institution." By the time I got home, the storm had fully broken, my business account frozen, my credit under review, my online tax portal logged out, and when I tried to reset the password, the site gave me an error. "This SSN does not exist in our records." At first I thought, no, this is just an error. But then I called the DMV. I needed to schedule a renewal anyway. The automated line routed me through 5 menus before a voice said, "We're sorry. The social security number provided is listed as inactive due to a death notice filed with the SSA." I stared at the phone in my hand like it had just announced the end of the world. "Excuse me," I said aloud even though no one could hear. I wasn't just locked out. I was erased. In the span of a week, maybe less, I had been pulled out of the legal fabric of the country. No longer a legal driver. No longer a registered business owner. No longer eligible for a mortgage, a passport, or even a job. Legally, Emerson Cade no longer existed. And that's when the full weight of Evelyn's warning hit me. If they try to erase you, they hadn't just challenged my inheritance. They'd launched a full-blown legal assassination. I sat at my dining table, Evelyn's trust file spread across the wood in front of me, heart pounding. No lawyer I called would even consult without verifying identity, which I couldn't prove. The passport office would take weeks to respond, and every government verification line ran in circles if your name was flagged as deceased. I was a ghost. I opened my laptop again, hand trembling. Somewhere in this web, Evelyn had left a thread. I typed her name into a legal records archive, her full name, Evelyn Margot Cade, not just in the probate court. I tried the Secretary of State's database, the county clerk's office. Then, out of instinct, I checked business licenses. There it was, buried under a corporate holding account registered 6 years earlier, Trust Archives, LLC, owned by E.M. Cade, registered to a P.O. box just outside town. I dug deeper. The registration listed a storage facility, Hillside Vaults and Record Management. I knew the place. It was the kind of off-site facility law firms used for legacy documents and overflow wills tucked between a dog kennel and a self-serve car wash. It didn't advertise. It didn't need to. My breath caught. The holding account had a client number linked to the Emerson Design Trust. Evelyn hadn't just created a trust. She'd created a backup system, one with off-site archives and corporate shielding, and she'd named it after me. I sat back in the chair, heart still racing, but something steadier rising in my chest. She knew they'd do this. She knew they'd try to rip out every route I had name access home, and she'd buried a seed somewhere they couldn't scorch. I pulled up the Hillside Vaults website. No online booking. Just a phone number and a fax line. I called. A calm voice answered. "Hillside Vaults." "How can we help?" I gave the account number. Said I was the named trustee. There was a pause. Then, "One moment, please." Can you confirm your access key or present valid trustee credentials on site? I hesitated, then remembered the tiny brass key Evelyn had slipped into the envelope. It was still on my nightstand. On one side, 1929. On the other, a 6-digit code. I read it aloud. Silence. Then, we can confirm your access. The file is available for in-person retrieval only. Shall I mark your visit as expected? I nodded before realizing they couldn't see me. Yes, I said. Tomorrow morning. I hung up, hands buzzing. Somewhere in that vault was everything I needed, not just to reclaim my life, but to prove that it had never been theirs to erase. Outside, the sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across my windows. I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared out at the darkening sky. I'd been disowned, discredited, and now legally buried. But I had something they didn't. A trail Evelyn left just for me. And tomorrow, I was following it. The next morning, the parking lot at Hillside Vaults sat half empty under a slate-gray sky. The building itself looked more like a doctor's office than a records facility. Low beige brick-frosted windows, a buzzer at the door. No branding, no signs. Discretion was clearly the product here. I pressed the intercom. A clipped voice answered, "Name and appointment, Emerson Cade," I said. "Access code 1929. A pause, then a mechanical click. Inside, the air was cool and dry, the lights dim and indirect. A receptionist, maybe in her 60s with steel gray hair and a mauve cardigan, stood behind a polished desk, no computer in sight. Just a ledger book and a locked file drawer. She studied me, then opened the drawer, pulled out a labeled envelope, and handed it across without a word. I signed a slip. That was it. No questions, no small talk. That was the whole transaction. Back in my car, I didn't wait. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a USB drive, a sealed manila folder stamped Truster Supplemental File, private, and a handwritten note on Evelyn's stationery in her unmistakable looping cursive. "If you're holding this, they did what I feared, but you're still standing, so now finish it." My breath caught. I drove straight home, hands trembling on the wheel, the envelope like a live wire in the passenger seat. Once inside, I locked the door, shut the blinds, and slid the USB into my laptop. The folder opened immediately. One video, one PDF, one scanned set of legal documents. I clicked play. Evelyn appeared on screen, seated in her sunroom. The light poured in behind her, catching the silver in her hair, the fine lines on her face. She looked directly at the camera. "Hello, my Emerson," she said. Her voice was soft but clear, steady. "If you're watching this, it means things went wrong. Maybe worse than we imagined. But it also means you're still here, and that means it's time to act." She paused, took a breath. Legacies don't always pass cleanly, especially not when greed sits at the table. I watched how they looked at you, how they treated you, like you were a footnote, a placeholder until something better came along. But you were never that to me. My throat tightened. That house was never just mine, it was ours. We planted every seed together. You restored those stairs with your own hands, and you kept coming back even when they didn't. So I did what had to be done. The screen faded. Then documents appeared, scanned PDFs. The first, last will and testament of Evelyn M. Cade, addendum and replacement. It was notarized, dated 11 months before her passing, with a new executor, the Emerson Design Trust. Next, a transfer of ownership for the house at 64 Hillside Lane, not just to me, but to a nonprofit one I didn't even know existed. The Second Seat Foundation, its mission transitional housing and mentorship for women aging out of foster care. And beneath that, incorporation documents listing me as both founder and trustee. Evelyn had turned the home into something more than inheritance. She had weaponized it into a shelter, a statement. I clicked back to the video. "I know they'll contest it," she said. "Mark will huff and puff. Deborah will throw wine glasses. Well, she'll have to choose who she is. But none of that matters. What matters is that you stand your ground. This isn't just about the house. It's about your name, your place, You're proof that blood doesn't define worth. Tears blurred my vision. I gave you what I couldn't give myself in time, a clean break. Use it well. The screen went black. I sat there, the weight of her words pressing on my chest like a second heartbeat. She had planned for everything. The forged documents, the legal ambush, even the erasure of my identity. And while they were busy playing petty power games, Evelyn had built something bigger than all of them, something that couldn't be ripped in half or signed away in secret. I looked down at the folder in my lap. Second Seat Foundation. I whispered the name to myself. This wasn't just a trust. It was a torch, and I was ready to carry it. The door to Raffi Winslow's office didn't match what I expected from a man with a reputation for dismantling trust frauds like demolition sites. It was quiet, understated brass handle, dark oak frame, a frosted plaque that simply read, Winslow and Hall Estate Council. But inside the tension was sharper than any courtroom cross-examination. Raffi was already standing when I walked in. He wasn't tall, but he didn't need to be. There was a coiled stillness about him like someone who only moved when precision required it. Trim beard, square glasses, navy sport coat over a gray Henley. Not flashy, but nothing about him said easy target either. "You're Emerson Cade," he said. Not a question. I nodded. He extended a hand, not casually but firmly. "Let's get to work." We sat across from each other in a room lined with casebooks, framed litigation articles, and one photo of Raffi shaking hands with a federal judge I vaguely recognized from the news. A paralegal slipped in with coffee I hadn't asked for. Raffi never touched his. I handed over the folder Evelyn had left. The real trust documents, the scanned video transcript, and finally, the altered legal forms from the recorder's office, the ones that had stripped me of my name and sold the house to an unnamed holding company in Delaware. He read silently for 10 minutes. I could hear the hum of the overhead light. I didn't interrupt. Then he leaned back. "They went full tilt," he murmured. "Not just a name erasure. This is identity-level fraud." I figured that I said, trying to keep the shake out of my voice. "But I can't even access my own tax records. The IRS thinks I'm dead." He glanced at me sharp. "That's the part that may work in our favor. Faking a death filing is federal." He turned to his computer, typed something in, and pulled up a split screen. One side showed a scanned signature from the medical power of attorney supposedly signed by Evelyn 2 months ago. The other side displayed a copy of Evelyn's 2006 driver's license application, which I recognized instantly. The smudged loop of her middle initial, the narrow tail of her last E. He tapped the screen. "See this here? Identical pressure dips. Exact vector slope. This signature was lifted digitally or manually from a known form. Sloppy work." My stomach tightened. "So it's provable." "Oh, it's more than provable. It's prosecutable." He slid the second document toward me, the transfer of ownership that had supposedly moved the house into a temporary family trust just weeks before the will reading. At the bottom was the kicker. I'd skimmed over it before. Not this time. Witnessed by Ara Cade, Notary Public. I stared at the name. My throat dried. "Ara," I whispered. "She signed this, she notarized it," Raffi said. "Which is worse. It means she vouched for its legitimacy under state law." I leaned back, blood draining from my face. "Ara," the one who always sat just out of reach of the family drama, who never raised her voice, who once brought me ice cream after my first failed geometry test. "She must have been pressured," I murmured. Raffi arched a brow. Or compensated. I didn't respond. He let the silence hang for a moment, then closed to the file. "I'm going to bring in a forensic document analyst. She's sharp. She'll confirm the lift and the replication markers. Once we have that, we'll build a case. Trust fraud, identity manipulation, destruction of testamentary intent." I nodded, the words swimming around me like ice water. Then, quieter. "Will I ever get it back? The house?" he asked. "No." "My name." He paused. Something shifted in his face, softened just slightly. "Emerson." He said they buried paper, not the person. "We'll unearth both." I swallowed hard. I need to warn you, he continued. If this goes forward, they'll fight dirtier. They've already crossed lines. It may get worse before it gets better. I thought of Evelyn's voice on the screen. But you're still standing, so now finish it. I nodded. Let them. He extended a small slip of paper. My analyst's name is Kendra. She'll be here Monday. Until then, document everything. Dates, times, calls. And if anyone contacts you directly, you don't respond. Send it to me. I took the paper, stood. My legs felt steadier than they had in days. Thanks, I said. Rafi looked up, calm fire in his gaze. Don't thank me yet. They're going to try to scorch the ground. But they forgot one thing. What's that? He smiled, just faintly. You're the one holding the matches. The cafe on Polk Street hadn't changed since college. Same clinking china, same dusty chalkboard menu, same faded velvet booths by the windows. It was the kind of place you met someone when you didn't want to raise your voice. Quiet, neutral. A battlefield disguised as brunch. Ara was already there when I arrived, hunched over a half-finished cup of green tea, stirring it absently with a wooden stick. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that came from lack of sleep, but the kind born from too much pretending. She stood when she saw me smiling the way someone does when they don't know what you've come to say. Hey, Emmy, she said. That nickname. Soft, familiar. Weaponized by memory. I sat down without returning it. She didn't seem surprised. We ordered me black coffee, her a fresh cup of the same green tea. I waited. She tapped at the side of her cup, avoiding my eyes. Finally, she spoke. I didn't know, Ara said. Not really. My phone sat screen down beside the salt shaker, already recording. Didn't know what I asked flatly, that it was the deed, the will, any of it. Dad just said it was some restructuring paperwork. For taxes. Something to make sure things didn't get messy. I stared at her. And you believed him? She winced. I didn't ask questions. No, I said quietly. You didn't. She folded her hands on the table. Her manicure was chipped, something rare for her. Ara always looked like she was ready to host a PTA fundraiser at a moment's notice. After Mom's cancer scare last year, she continued, they started treating everything like it was code red. I was helping them file stuff, driving her to appointments. I thought, maybe if I was useful enough, if I kept things calm, I'd stay on the inside. And signing your name to a forged notary wasn't a red flag. I didn't know it was forged. She looked at me now. I swear. I didn't read it. I just signed. My mouth felt dry. You signed away my name, I said. My life. You watched them erase me and said nothing. Ara's voice cracked. I thought it was just procedural. I didn't know they were trying to God Emmy. I didn't know. But when you found out, when you saw the deed ripped in half in front of that room, when the lawyer announced my name and they laughed like it was a joke, you still said nothing. She blinked fast. What was I supposed to do? Call it out in front of everyone. You could have looked me in the eye. She had no answer. The server dropped off our drinks. Neither of us touched them. Ara reached into her bag and pulled out a white envelope. She slid it across the table. I wrote a statement, she said. If you need it for your lawyer, I'll testify I didn't understand what I signed, that I thought it was tax-related, that I was never told it would override Evelyn's trust. I didn't touch it. She tried again. I'm sorry, Emerson. I looked at her, finally really looked. At the sister who braided my hair before 8th grade photos, who split M&Ms by color and gave me all the green ones, who once swore to my 12-year-old self that we'd always be each other's safe place. That promise hadn't made it to adulthood. You chose safety, I said, standing up, sliding the phone back into my coat pocket. I chose truth. Her eyes welled. You think I had a choice? We all do, I said. Some just cost more. Ara didn't follow me out, didn't call my name. She just sat there, hands wrapped around a cup she'd never drink from in a booth that suddenly felt like it belonged to strangers. Outside, the fog had lifted. The wind carried the faint scent of eucalyptus, sharp and grounding. I paused at the corner and looked back through the window. She hadn't moved. We were born into different storms. But in that moment, I realized she'd made peace with the flood. I had learned to swim, and we were no longer on the same shore. I never intended to go public. I wasn't chasing headlines. I just wanted my name back, the house Evelyn left me, and the truth documented and known in a courtroom where paper still carried weight. But the courts moved slow. My family, on the other hand, moved fast and ruthlessly. So when I sat down across from Isla Brandt in the newsroom of the San Francisco Sentinel, I felt like I'd stepped into a storm shelter just seconds before the funnel cloud hit. Isla had been a friend since undergrad, though friend wasn't strong enough. She once covered for me through 2 internships, rewrote half my grant proposal at 2 a.m., and was the only person who ever saw me cry after Evelyn's first hospital stay. Now, she was an investigative reporter, sharp and unflinching, with a gift for exposing quiet betrayals that wore nice suits. "You're sure?" she asked after I slid the USB drive across her desk. "Once I run this, there's no walking it back." "I'm sure," I said. "They've erased me on paper. Let's remind the world I'm still standing." She opened the drive and Evelyn's voice filled the tiny office. Calm, measured, devastating. "If you're watching this, they did what I feared, but you're still standing, so now finish it." Isla's jaw clenched. "You've got receipts." I handed her the notarized trust, the forensic analysis Rafi's document expert had prepared the deed from the piano bench. She scanned through each with eyes trained to spot manipulation. "And this is your sister's statement." "She didn't know," I said, "but she signed anyway." Isla nodded. "This'll burn." The story broke 48 hours later. Headline above the fold black and white print that bit like truth, "Veteran designer declared dead by her own family still holds the deed." They used an old photo of me and Evelyn laughing in front of the Cade house during the community mural project in 2016. My name trended within hours. Designers reposted it. Activists reshared the will video. Architects I hadn't spoken to in years sent quiet messages of support. But support was never quiet for long. Local news stations picked it up, then regional. Then a clip from Evelyn's video hit a trending Reddit thread titled, "This Grandma Outsmarted Everyone." And just like that, the narrative my parents tried so hard to control snapped in half. The backlash was swift. Within 3 days, the Cade family firm's Yelp page was flooded with reviews that read more like obituaries for decency. Their consulting contracts with 2 local municipalities were placed under urgent review. Someone graffitied "She's not dead" in chalk across their downtown office steps. So Mark did what powerful men do when the walls start cracking. He held a press conference. The media room at the Civic Center was full. He stood at the podium flanked by Deborah and their crisis PR manager, a woman who looked like she hadn't blinked in 20 minutes. "We love our daughter," he began, "but Emerson has been estranged from our family for some time." I watched from Isla's office. She muted it halfway through. "She's trying to paint a tragic narrative," Mark said, "but the truth is she has long struggled with mental and emotional challenges. We hope she finds peace, but these claims about forgery manipulation." Isla didn't flinch. She just clicked play on her phone. The full Evelyn video already uploaded to 3 major platforms. On screen. Evelyn looked straight into the lens. "If they call you unstable, remember stability is not compliance. They will say you were estranged. I say you were brave enough to stand apart." She paused, then added, "You have always been my granddaughter Emerson. Not by blood, but by choice, and I choose you still." It aired nationally by the end of the week. No edits, no commentary. Just Evelyn silencing them from beyond the grave. The press conference was cut short. Deborah whispered something into Mark's ear, and they left mid-question. That moment, the walk-off went viral. Side-by-side clips of Evelyn's unwavering calm against Mark's fumbling dismissal were shared with captions like, "Guess who told the truth, and legacy doesn't lie." But it wasn't just internet noise. The State Notary Commission opened an inquiry into the name change and fraudulent document filing. A civil suit was initiated, and the judge overseeing Evelyn's estate formally froze all asset transfers tied to the Cade family trust until the investigation concluded. I wasn't just a ghost anymore. I was visible, documented, real, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without checking the locks twice. They tried to burn me down in silence. Now, the whole country was watching the smoke. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No dramatic high ceilings or echoing chambers like you see in movies. Just beige walls, 2 bright fluorescents, and a seal of the state mounted behind the judge's bench, like a quiet warning truth carries weight here. The Cade family sat 2 rows ahead of me, Mark, in a navy blazer he'd probably worn to every board meeting for 20 years, Deborah stiff beside him in a pearl gray suit, and Ara, alone at the edge, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't turn around. I didn't expect her to. Raffi Winslow stood beside me at the petitioner's table, crisp and composed. He'd prepared every piece of evidence like it was an instrument in a carefully conducted symphony, one movement at a time, nothing rushed, nothing spared. His briefcase sat closed on the table, but I knew what it held. The truth. Signed, sealed, and backed by law. The bailiff called the room to order. Judge Miriam Danvers, late 50s, sharp eyes behind tortoiseshell glasses, took her seat. She glanced once at each table, then opened the file in front of her. We're here today in the matter of Evelyn Cade's estate, specifically concerning the rightful deed holder of 64 Hillside Lane and the legitimacy of documents submitted for transfer. Raffi stood. Your Honor. We're submitting the following into evidence: a notarized trust document titled The Emerson Design Trust, dated 8 months prior to Mrs. Cade's death. A video file in which Mrs. Cade speaks directly to the circumstances of this case. A forensic analysis proving fraudulent use of her signature on documents dated post-mortem, and a corroborating statement from witness Ara Cade regarding her role in those filings. Judge Danvers arched an eyebrow. That's quite a file. Because this wasn't just an error, Raffi said evenly. It was an orchestrated attempt to erase my client's legal identity and inheritance. Mark rose before the judge could respond. Your Honor, this is a family dispute. My wife and I were acting in what we believed were the best interests of the estate. My mother-in-law was not of sound mind in her final months. My daughter Emerson was distant, estranged. She was declared legally dead, Raffi interrupted. That's not estrangement. That's annihilation. The judge held up her hand. Mr. Cade, did you or your wife file any official paperwork claiming your daughter was deceased? Mark shifted. It was a misunderstanding, a clerical mistake. We were told by a paralegal. Do you have that paralegal here? No, ma'am. Raffi stepped forward. Your Honor, Exhibit E in our file includes a Social Security Administration letter stating Ms. Cade's status was changed to deceased based on an identity verification submitted with a falsified power of attorney, signed after Mrs. Cade's recorded date of death. I believe the term misunderstanding doesn't cover the gravity here. The judge nodded slowly. Let's view the video testimony. The bailiff dimmed the lights slightly as the monitor came to life. Evelyn's face appeared firm, kind, steady. She wore her favorite navy blouse, the one she used to call her serious shirt, and her hands folded over a stack of papers. If this is playing, she began, then my fears were not paranoia. Emerson Cade is my legal heir. I established the trust in her name because I believed in her work, her integrity, and her character. The others Mark Deborah may claim confusion. But I assure you I was not confused. I was protective. I anticipated deceit. This is my voice, uncoerced and deliberate. The room stayed quiet even after the video ended. No one moved. The judge flipped through the file once more, pausing at the forensic report and trust registration. Then she looked at me. Ms. Cade, you're the beneficiary of this trust, yes, Your Honor. You've submitted the original deed and the trust has been verified as legally binding. Yes. She looked over at Mark and Deborah. Do you dispute this trust's validity? Mark opened his mouth, but Deborah touched his arm. He said nothing. Judge Danvers leaned back in her chair. Then it is the finding of this court that Emerson Cade is the legal heir to the property located at 64 Hillside Lane. All previous documents attempting to transfer ownership through the Cade family trust are hereby voided. Furthermore, I am ordering an inquiry into the possibility of estate fraud and identity suppression. This will be referred to the district attorney's office immediately. My lungs finally remembered how to breathe. Raffi placed a calm hand on my shoulder. "You're not invisible anymore," he whispered. The gavel came down once. Sharp. Final. The room erupted into murmurs as the bailiff called for order. I turned to leave without glancing at the Cades, but as I passed the second row, I saw Ara watching me. No apology this time. Just quiet, unmovable regret. Outside, the sky was unusually clear. Sunlight stretched down between buildings, warm and sharp, lighting the sidewalk like a stage. I had walked into that courtroom carrying every ounce of silence they'd once forced on me. I walked out holding my name, and in the distance beyond the headlines and damage control and family fiction, the house Evelyn left me still stood, not just a structure, not just inheritance, proof that legacy, when protected with truth, survives everything. The key slid into the lock like it had never left. No cameras, no crowd. Just me standing on the porch of 64 Hillside Lane with dusk curling over the rooftops and the quiet creak of wood that remembered who I was. The front door opened with a familiar sigh, and for the first time in weeks, maybe years, I stepped inside, not as someone trying to prove I belonged, but as someone who no longer needed to. The house was exactly as Evelyn had left it. A gentle layer of dust had gathered along the windowsills, the scent of lavender and wood polish faint, but still clinging to the air like memory. I walked the perimeter of each room, slowly, palms brushing door frames, fingertips grazing wallpaper seams I used to trace with wonder as a teenager when I thought old homes held magic. I paused in the sunroom where the morning light used to spill across Evelyn's open sketchbooks, where she once told me, "Don't build what impresses. Build what shelters." I didn't cry, not because there wasn't grief, but because something deeper had taken its place: resolution. The kind Evelyn had modeled every day with her soft words and unshakable spine. I slept that night in her old room, just a mattress on the floor and one blanket. No need to unpack, because I already knew I wouldn't be staying. By the following week, the paperwork was filed. The house wouldn't go back on the market, nor would I move in as some triumphant heir reclaiming a lost crown. That wasn't what this place was for. It never had been. At City Hall, I submitted the trust amendment the full property would be redesignated as a nonprofit transitional residence for women in architecture, urban planning, and military reintegration. Those who had been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed out. The application read, "The Evelyn Cade House, a living space for those rebuilding a life in design." A month later, I stood on the front steps again, but not alone. Rafi was beside me in a charcoal coat, holding the final certificate of registration. Camila Rojas, a young architect from New Mexico who'd just aged out of the VA transitional housing system, carried the folded ribbon for the small dedication ceremony. We didn't invite press, just the first 3 residents and 2 volunteers from a nearby university's design school. As the last bolt was drilled into the plaque post beside the garden path, I stepped forward and smoothed the bronze with my palm. The inscription was simple: for Evelyn. For the ones they tried to erase. Behind me, the new residents carried donated furniture inside chairs with clean lines, a circular table, a used drafting desk already bearing pencil smudges from a woman who hadn't drawn in years, but now had reason to start again. I didn't give speeches. There was no champagne, just cider, and a note pinned to the corkboard in the kitchen. This house is not a favor. It's a foundation. Later, I stood alone in Evelyn's old music room, now freshly painted and reimagined as a shared reading space. The grand piano bench still bore the marks from when I pried it open, the secret drawer no longer hiding anything. I left it that way on purpose, visible. A reminder that some truths need to be found, not buried. Rafi stopped in the doorway. "You okay?" I nodded. "Better than okay." He smiled. "So this is what you do with the real inheritance." "It's what she wanted," I said quietly. "Not just the house. The impact, the forward motion." We stood there for a while. No one needed to say it, but we both knew the fight was over. The scars would linger. Public records don't forget easily. But the story had changed. The ending wasn't retribution. It was restoration. That night, I left a final note in the drawer beneath the piano seat. I didn't sign it. Just wrote, "If you're sitting here searching for something you were told you couldn't have, you're not alone. Start here, then build forward." Then, I closed the lid, gently turned off the lights and stepped outside. The porch light clicked on behind me as I walked down the path toward the gate where the new residents laughed over mismatched mugs of cocoa. Some people inherit fortune, others inherit legacies. I got Evelyn, and in the end, that was more than enough. The sun dipped low as I sat on the porch steps Evelyn used to sand every spring. The boards were worn but solid beneath me. In my lap, I held two things: the deed to 64 Hillside Lane embossed and final, and a photo of Evelyn standing in front of the Cade Design Studio chin, lifted sleeves rolled. She always stood like she belonged in every room, even when no one else believed it. The house behind me wasn't mine anymore, not really. Not in the way they thought. I'd filed the paperwork that morning to designate it as a non-profit transitional home, a space for women in design architecture and the military who needed a place to rebuild, just like I once had. They tore the copy of the deed, thinking they'd erased me from more than paper, but Evelyn saw them coming. She'd planned for all of it: the forged signatures, the legal ambush, even the public smear. She gave me the map, the documents, the tools. But more than that, she gave me the story I'd build from. I wasn't here for vengeance. I never was. They'll face investigations, yes, and I'll testify when the time comes. But this, what we're making now in her name, is the only legacy that matters. Raffi had just left. He'd brought the new brass plaque earlier and helped install it on the porch rail. I glanced back at it now, catching the last glint of sunlight for Evelyn. For the ones they tried to erase. It was never about reclaiming what they stole. It was about creating something they couldn't touch. I looked down at the deed once more, then tucked it carefully back into my coat pocket. The photo of Evelyn I kept in my hand, and as I sat there with the porch creaking beneath me and the future quiet but steady behind that front door, I said it aloud. Just once. They tore the deed, but they didn't know I was already building something they couldn't touch.